since I started flying. I had to work to keep from dying, especially since I came to Vietnam. Seems on every combat sortie, that's when Charlie tries to zort me, when I'm shooting guns and dropping bombs. Someday, when my tour is over, I'll lay dreaming deep in clover about you silly bastards dropping bombs.
My name is Steve Umland, and I joined the Air Force. I was a rudderless 19-year-old kid driving a truck. I was exempt from the draft and decided I had to go do something, so I decided I'd go into the service. And I went and talked to the Marine recruiter, and my dad was a Marine in World War II in the Pacific. I went home, told him I decided to join the Marines. I've been thinking he'd be proud of me, and he said, "Are you the stupidest person that's ever walked the face of the earth? There's a little thing called Vietnam going on." He says, "You're either going into the Air Force or the Navy," and I was born and raised in San Diego, and I wasn't going in the Navy because those assholes stole all of our girlfriends in high school. So I went in the Air Force. So I enlisted and went in April of 1969, and I took an aptitude test. I did very poorly in school. And the aptitude test, I still kind of this day think that they put my name on somebody else's test because I scored very, very high. And they put me through and what I wanted to do. And it was either Air Force intelligence or, air traffic control. And so when I got out of Lackland, they sent me up to Lowry Air Force Base out of Denver. And went through photo interpretation 206 and became a photo interpreter. And I was just turning 20 when I got my orders to go home for, I think it was a week, then go up to Travis Air Force Base, get on an airplane, and go to Southeast Asia. I had no idea. On my orders, all it said was I had to go through Tan Son Nhut, go over to Bangkok, and then go up to Nakhon Phanom, and I was being assigned to a place called Task Force Alpha. And I always asked, "What is this task?" And everybody went, "I never heard of it." It was super, super top secret place doing stuff I didn't know anything about. I always laugh because I got there on November 27th, 26th, 27th, and I was there, just trying to assimilate in. I lived in a tent. I loved living in the tent for the whole time I was there, almost the whole time. And Bob Hope came in to do his show in December of 1969. He flew in. He says, "This base is so top secret they made the pilots put blindfolds on to fly in here." So I always laugh about that. I didn't know, but the security was so tight. Task Force Alpha was designed to drop sensors in on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. What they wanted to do was try to monitor and figure out. I've been told a couple of different stories. Westmoreland was very upset with the Tet Offensive, that they didn't know in 1968 that they were coming down, and they started Task Force Alpha in 67, 68, and it was operational obviously when I got there in 69, and it was, nobody knew anything about it, and people think of the Ho Chi Minh Trail as a trail, and it wasn't. It was an incredibly elaborate motor. There were hundreds and hundreds of roads, paths, trails that came out of North Vietnam, came down the Mugai Pass in 4 or 5 total different directions. And we were using F-4 aircraft dropping sensors into, and then the sensors, we dropped over 20,000 sensors. And a sensor would be operational for maybe 2 weeks, a little bit, two and a half weeks long. And Task Force Alpha, it was like right out of Star Wars. In 1969 when I went there, I mean, it wasn't even real to me. It was, there were guys sitting all night long when the traffic was moving. They would sit there with headphones on, and they would tell you, a truck went by, they would tell you what gear it was in, how fast it was going, how heavy it was. There were sensors in the ground to tell you how much movement there was. They would be able to tell you 50 NVA soldiers walked past here. They could tell you if a bicycle went by that was laden down with rice. And so what we tried to do, and I sat, and I didn't do it all the time, only a few times, but I would go to the war room at night, and I would sit, and it was really literally Star Wars. There, the whole panel was lit up, the strings, and they had little lights on them, and it would tell you a truck would enter, boom, 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 and there'd be 20 trucks go through this string, and they called them strings. And then there might be 5-6 miles before the next string. And if you knew that those 20 trucks or whatever went through that, then we would go out and try to find them the next day. We'd get the film. Either we would get film that was shot the day before, or we'd go back to old film because of the camouflage and everything that was over the trail. They made elaborate. The other thing they did, these were through the karst formations that went through Laos. They would dig huge tunnels, and they would take these trucks and everything else and go into the tunnels.
Did they call those Bintrons, where they were like stations for the vehicles in the tunnels? Or
I haven't heard that, but that sounds right. And they had all kinds of different. They had bulldozers. It was very sophisticated, and we would do the fords that would go across the rivers. We obviously blew up every bridge very, very early on, so they would put them over. We'd go in with BDA, we'd look and see, and they'd say, yeah, we got 40 trucks, 30 trucks going through this particular set. So we'd shoot a picture, and I've got examples of all this. We'd shoot a picture of it, then we would do BDA, which was the actual blowing up of the fjord, and then we would run a mission right after that to see how much damage that we really did. And on these, we would have 8x10s. We'd send to the lab and say, give me an 8x10. They would go out and brief a pilot and say, this is what you're looking for. I'll tell you a little story I love. Staff Sergeant Nusspickle, which I was hoping would be here, but I don't think he's going to make it on this one. He was sitting there, and we would bounce back and stuff over. We had Richard's light tables, and I've got a photograph of me sitting at my table with the film over it, and you go through it and you find something, and you call the other people over in the room and say, you know, take a look at this. I think this is this. And I remember Nusspickle said one day, man, I think I got a truck here. I think I got a truck, maybe 2 trucks under the canopy here. Some of the film was stereo, so you could try to see under. Some of it was infrared, but it was predominantly all black and white. And we looked, and he said, yeah, he says, I think there's trucks sitting up, but I can't really see them. And I remember our captain came in and he goes, it's a slow day. Why don't we just go ahead and we'll put a strike in on it before they can move them. And we'll never forget, we were sitting there, and the guys that would go over, and they would tell us, they would drop and say, we've just dropped 2 500-pounders. We've got a major explosion. We've got 3 minor explosions after that, and maybe this. The guy that ran the mission and went in there, he's this, I can't even count him. It's like the whole canopy is exploding. He said, stick around and tell us, you know, how much, where, and he was going over and over, and he goes, well, I'm running out of fuel. It's still blowing up. I got to leave. And we had a fat guy, forward air controller with an OB-10. He said it burned for 3 days solid. It was a fuel depot. And I've got a photograph of it, which I can show you, of what it looked like afterwards. And it was just 50-gallon drums as far as you could see that was underneath this canopy with all these trucks.
I remember several A-1 pilots bringing up that story.
Oh.
They were saying, it burned for days.
Yes, it blew up and and you're just hoping. I'll tell you another story I love is I was brand new. I hadn't been there probably a month and a half, and I'm going up, and I was just up on the upper Laos Mugai Pass and up toward the North Vietnam, and I found a camouflage pit that was covered, and then it had tunnels, canals that went out to what looked like 4 or 5 anti-aircraft guns. And I looked at it, and we had books that we would go open a book and say, this is what this looks like, if it was a MiG aircraft or whatever it was. And so I put the thing in, I said, yeah, this is a radar-controlled anti-aircraft battery. Pulled a guy over, and they said, what do you guys think? He said, well, yeah, I think that's what it looks like, but no, it's not there. I said, what? He goes, no, it's not there. And I said, that's surely what it looks like. He said, we can't put a strike in on that. And it was about 4 or 5 days later, he came and he patted me on the back, and he said they had let some of the pilots, the OV-10 pilots, and an OV-10 pilot came back and he said, they said there was maybe a radar-controlled anti-aircraft up here. He said, it couldn't have been 15 seconds later. The entire world exploded about 30 feet in front of his airplane. And obviously their radar had not gotten his speed correctly and stuff. And so, and it always bothered me. Here I am 20 years old, and I found out years later, decades later, that Nixon was going back and forth and with Kissinger, and they were trying to get the peace talks going in Paris. And that he said that's when they stopped the bombing. They were going to stop the bombing in North Vietnam. And one of the conditions was, we'll stop the bombing if you don't have any surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, or any radar-controlled anti-aircraft in Laos. So they couldn't report it because it would have violated, and they wanted to be back. And it's absolutely amazing. But
that whole treaty, from the very beginning, the Paris Accords on through.
Yes.
Was an absolute catastrophe.
Oh, for the war.
Yeah.
For everything we were doing.
The communists and the North Vietnamese, they didn't care.
No.
They were running everything down that trail. They violated the treaties. I mean, I don't think they even took notice of it.
No, they didn't care.
We were trying to be delicate, and the amount of manpower that we put in to watch those trails and do what we could is unbelievable.
In the article that I wrote for the Friends, the Air Force magazine, I said, and they disputed it, and so I had to take it out of the article, but the research I did showed that we dropped more bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos than they did in World War II and Korea combined. But they wouldn't let me put it in there. They didn't like that number. But we were bombed. I would go downtown, and we weren't allowed to spend the night in NKP, but many of us did. And I remember that I was on a balcony, and you could look right across the Mekong River and see the karst formations, and that was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We could hear the B-52 strikes they were putting in at night. They just were continuous. There was one photograph that I love that we dropped heavy hook guys. They were dropping in to do intelligence, and on top of one of the karst formations, those guys would climb up on the karst formations to either be put in or taken out. And in it, and I have the photograph, somebody laid out rocks that said "SAC sucks" from the Strategic Air Command. They didn't like. You could see and feel them 60, 70. I can't imagine what it would have been like a mile away. But those guys were. And another photograph I have is that it was so discouraging to have a mission. You would run right up to the border, and then right at the border there would be a truck camp. And it would be all these hundreds and hundreds of trucks loaded, getting ready. They were changing tires on them, getting ready. And they would just sit there and wait till dark, and then they run them down the trail as fast as they could. we couldn't touch the trucks.
That was during the non-bombing
Yeah,
campaign.
yeah. And I mean, it was so discouraging. There are so many things I've read, and people have talked about Task Force Alpha not being effective. It ran, and mind you, this is 1968, $69, about $1 billion a year. They were saying they were running about $18 million a week. That was just a tremendous expense, and they said it wasn't really worth it. And I don't agree with that at all. I've always felt that if we stopped one truck, one bag of rice going down that trail, and you can make the argument that it wasn't worth it for the money, but you can't make the argument it wasn't worth doing.
I think they were probably, if you were talking $1 billion, they had to be bringing in the numbers of all the air assets and everything they were using and putting it under Task Force Alpha, wouldn't you say?
I'm not sure, and it's funny. I know that you guys have done interviews with Roger and those guys and the pilots, and I've sat down and talked to some of them. What's hard to understand is the intelligence that was coming out of Task Force Alpha went back to the Air Force in Saigon. The pilots that were at NKP never heard from us, or very, very little. Sometimes we'd have a target and we'd run an 8x10, and they would just go off into the hinterlands hoping it went to the right person. But that communication was extremely poor.
It seemed like everything went to Saigon, had to go through, I think,
7th Air Force.
Yes, it was 7th Air Force. And then there was also, he wasn't the governor, he was the ambassador. Everything had to go through the ambassador before it was released. Because when you talk to the SOG guys, every single mission that they pulled, heavy hook over, across the fence, had to be cleared through him before it was done.
And I still have a hard time believing that was actually true. I know that was the protocol and probably the majority, but I know there were missions that were done quicker that had to have gone through. I was in charge of getting our film. They were running, our film was being run by the F4s out of Udorn. They were processing it, and they had what they called Scat Pack. And Scat Pack was a little black Learjet. And they would take the film in a satchel, put it on the airplane, and fly it up. I would go out and with a truck and sit at the end of the runway. And they would fly in, come down, and most of the time the door would open. They would throw the satchel out and pull it up, and the plane would never stop. Go right back down and go down the runway and take off in black. No insignias, no US, no nothing. And every once in a while, they would stop, and a guy would step out. And they were always wearing all black and stuff. And he says, "Hey, can I get a ride over to the Heavy Hook compound?" Sure. I'd drive these guys, not having a clue.
Why don't we go into the definition of Heavy Hook, just for the visitors in case they haven't ever heard of Heavy Hook and what that was and how it worked with Task Force Alpha.
Heavy Hook was a CIA operation that was run out of Vincennes, and it was to drop guys on the Ho Chi Minh Trail that would sit and come back with direct intelligence. They would go in and sit in a tree for 10 days and just count people, and they knew the language. They would be able to hear it. And it was covert. They mainly ran them in with Air America. But I believe that there's some of the helicopters and stuff with NKP were used. But there was some SOG operations out of Nakhon Phanom also. But I didn't know anything about that. And I've read 2 books on SOG, and they talked about some of the operations. Mainly they were run out of South Vietnam, and they would run them right across into the Ho Chi Minh, either Cambodia or Laos. And then in one report I read where they said that they had a group that were running out of Vincennes and one group out of Nakhon Phanom. And I didn't know anything about that when I was there, But those guys were, and they were supporting the Pathet Lao, and they were supporting us and trying. I've always wondered how bad that must have been in '75 when we pulled all of those people that had worked for years, decades, on behalf of the United States of America. And
I did an interview with 3 South Vietnamese pilots.
oh,
And you should watch that because they'll tell you really quickly how they felt about that. They were not happy with the Congress. They're all very happy that they're U.S. citizens and that they'd survived the war, but man, they felt betrayed by Congress.
mm-hmm.
He said, there was a guy saying, on the news, we're leaving in 5 days. He said, do you know what that did with the Viet Cong? They went crazy.
Oh, and I feel bad that I was 20 years old. I was just a kid driving a truck. I didn't feel like I was very intellectual, but what really has bothered me over the years is I never asked the right questions of myself. I never asked why we were there or what we were doing. I was there doing a mission. I was learning. I was growing as a man. I was growing up, and I loved the work. But it just like, why were we there and what were we doing? And I left NKP, Nakhon Phanom, and I went up to Yokota Air Base to get in, and I was to the 67th, prestigious 67th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron in Yokota Air Base in Japan, and doing the air intelligence. We were also running the SR-71s over Southeast Asia, China, North Korea, and Eastern thing. And I absolutely loved the work, but I never said to myself, what are we doing here? Why? Well, I just did my job and I loved it. They did the 67th, and I was on the intelligence team at Yokota Air Base, Japan, when we did the Son Tay prison raid. We were looking at all the SR-71 film, doing the intelligence, and then when they pulled us all out, sent the entire squadron to the 548th at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, I moved off base into an apartment building, started taking night classes at the University of Hawaii, and started asking, for the first time, asked questions. I was taking political science classes, I was taking sociologies and classes and stuff, and and then all of a sudden I just went, what are we doing? I love America, I love it, I loved my country, I love what we were doing. I didn't question it, but I should have. I really think I should have asked more questions.
Can we circle back to the Son Tay prison raid and
Oh,
what
sure.
you were doing there? And I understand at a certain point you hit a maturity where you start asking those questions, and I think that comes at a later point in life. That's why
Yes.
they do recruit younger men and younger women, because there's a lot less questions and you're a little more malleable.
Yeah.
And as we get a little older, we start thinking, what was that all about?
No, and then I because I had the GI Bill, I got to be able to go back and get a degree, which I always wanted to do. But going back to Son Tay, I was sitting at the light table, my Richards light table, working a mission at Task Force Alpha, and the captain walked out and handed me the phone, and they were saying, "Where are you?" I said, "Well, I'm at work. I'm here at my light table." And they said, "Well, you're supposed to be rotating out. You're supposed to get on the Freedom Bird in 2 hours. They want you up at Yokota Air Base at the 67th." I said, here I am, airman, second class, first class, and I didn't know anything about it. Nobody told me I was rotating out. So they said, we're going to push it back 2 weeks. So I went up to Yokota Air Base and went in, and they were doing some incredible stuff, and I was like fish out of water compared to the missions that they were running. But I remember one of there was a master sergeant and a captain. He said, "Run this guy through his paces," and I didn't know that I was being sent up there because of what I had done at Task Force Alpha. And so I went through the mission, and I remember the captain looked at the master and said, I had to plot a mission and do a mission. He said, "How did he do?" And he says, "Better than I did." Okay, I guess I passed, But I tell a funny story about the 67th when we were up there. There's the green door, and you weren't allowed to go through the green door. And there was nobody on base that was allowed to know what the 67th was doing. The commander at the Yokota Air Base was not allowed to know what we did at the 67th. And they were running, I think it was McNamara, was on his way over to Vietnam and wanted to stop at Yokota they were refueling and wanted to come over to the 67th and have a briefing. And so the commander of the base picked him up, brought him to the 67th, and took him in, but they stopped the commander at the base and made him sit in a chair. He wasn't allowed to sit in the briefing because he didn't have the need to know. But anyway, so going back to, I go there and I go through the green door to the guard, and I say, "Hi, I'm Sergeant Umland, and here are my orders." They go, "You don't walk through the green door. Nobody walks through the green door without an escort." So I went back. I went back to the barracks, laid in my bunk for 3 days, and a guy walked in and he said, "You Sergeant Umland?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Why haven't you come over?" And I said, "I did. I'm not allowed to go through the green door." But anyway, so they were doing some really cool stuff at the 67th. I got called in one night, and this is the end of November, and we were running the SR-71 missions. We had run, I believe, and this is 50 years ago, so my dates.
Back on Son Tay, right?
Back on Son Tay. We were running the mission. I believe that we looked at was November 13th, and there was one on the 16th and one and 16th, 17th. So we were plotting them out, and we normally did missions, and there was a couple people in the room, and you would bounce stuff, and you had BE numbers on the SR-71 was so sophisticated. You would get a computer printout. Now, mind you, this is 1969-70. You would get a printout of what target was on what frame while they were processing the film. So you'd sit there and look at all this guy, and these missions started coming through, and they didn't have time to do that. So we were going through them, and they said, "Sergeant Umland, would you sit down and tell us what you see in this compound?" Back then, and I'm sure it's the same now, is they don't tell you what you're looking for or why, because you need to interpret it, what you see and what you feel, without being influenced. And that's what we did. So, I'm looking down on this compound, which was the Son Tay prison compound, 18 miles east of Hanoi. And we went through and we were talking about them, and they said, well, there was a mission back, they had a drone mission. And so went back and looked, and I said, well, give me the last two missions, because I could compare. I'd compare patterns on grass or whatever would move. It kind of give you an indication. And they say, no, you're not allowed to. So I said, so I remember I sat there and looked at it and studied it. I studied the grass patterns, and I studied the bicycles, and the bicycles are what really hit me. So they said, what do you think? And I remember I pushed my chair back and stood up. And the place was, the room was filled with people, which it never was. And I said, I think it's abandoned. I don't think there's anybody there. And it was not what they wanted to hear in the room. They were only 2 days out. And I forgot the guy's name who was from the DIA. And he was a photo interpreter with the 67th, got out and was working independently. And he was the photo interpreter with the intelligence going to the raiders who were waiting in Thailand. And I said, well, I said, why do you think that? And they said, well, the prisoners are maybe in their cell blocks and they're not letting them out. I said, no, I said, I don't see enough activity on the outside of the compound to indicate that you have to have so many guards and all that. And the bicycles should have moved. And I wasn't seeing the bicycles move in patterns. And so and one guy said, well, how do you know we were hoping that there were 50 plus POWs there, or that's the intelligence that told us there were that many. And I said, well, I've been at Task Force Alpha, and if one of our sensors said 50 NVA walked past this sensor, I would look at it and I know what it looks like if there's 50 people. And I just didn't see it. And I'm not proud of the fact, and I never will be, that I felt like I was right. I think the decision had already been made well above that. They were going in. They were going to go in and try to pull those pilots out. And there's no words that I can explain how we felt in that room when we heard that they had gone in and there were no POWs, because they would have got them out. They really would have. It was a special operations unit that. Thank God we have people doing that for our military.
They trained for months.
3 months.
Mission. 3 months for that mission.
Yep, they had built a compound out of sheets and everything else and run through that whole thing, and they didn't lose a single person. They lost that aircraft, but pulled the pilots out. And the one guy broke his ankle from a fire extinguisher breaking loose in the helicopter. And one of the helicopters going in landed in the wrong spot, which really could have compromised the mission, but it didn't. But here at the reunion, there's one of the guys that was actually one of the raiders that was on the helicopter. And he said they trained 3 months for every contingency except one. That if there weren't any POWs there, so how that was really sad. That was a sad night.
I remember hearing through the chain of command when they said it was an empty target. Now what do we do? And saying to that point, what do you do now?
Yeah.
And they were concerned on how are they going to get out of there. And I know I've listened to the audio tapes of that, and there were several SAM missiles that were fired.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and it was just. They were yanking and banking to get out of there.
All the support aircraft and everything that they had. And the other part of the whole operation that had come in off the coast that they didn't even know from the aircraft carriers to make them think they were going in for something else. If you're interested in military history, special ops, study up on the Son Tay prison raid, because it was pretty incredible what they did. So.
They moved the prisoners, I believe, was it 2 weeks ahead of time? Just before you saw those photos, I think they moved them, roughly.
Yeah, I've looked at that and talked to a number of people, and there's just no consensus on that. Some people say that they moved because there's a river that flowed around their compound, that river overflowed. And they moved them. Then there was another report I heard that the well dried up, and that they had to move it and stuff. Another thing that I heard that I disagree with was that the true intelligence aerial reconnaissance was done by the DIA and not the photo interpreters at the 67th, and I disagree with that. We were looking at every bush to see what all of the anti-aircraft, the SAMs, all of that infrastructure was around there, but we ran those missions just like a normal mission, looking for everything. So one side note to that I thought was interesting, and I'm terrible with names, so I won't get names right. But there was our commander, our lieutenant commander, Lieutenant Colonel of the 67th, wrote a book. And if you want to look up the book, it's called Asia from Air. And in there, there's about 5 pages on the Son Tay thing. There was a captain and a lieutenant that they were going over the mission plots. And one of the guys noticed that 3 of the missions crisscrossed at the Son Tay prison. And one of the guys said, oh, they're going after the prisoners. And the whole place stopped. And they got yelled at, they got escorted out of the building. And the feeling was that if somebody at the 67th could figure that out, maybe somebody in North Vietnam would be able to figure that out.
The SOG guys and quite a few others have alluded to that there was a mole in Saigon that was constantly tipping people off.
Yep.
So you're not sure, they've never found or proved that there was, but I do know that
the evidence is pretty compelling.
Yeah. You ask any of the Green Berets that got dropped on the ground and their locations had been sent to Hanoi first, and as soon as they hit, they were under fire immediately.
But I see, the thing is that there was no indication that they had MiGs up or anything else for the Son Tay prison raid. Yes, there were SAMs around there, but if they would have had any idea, they would have moved SAMs and anti-aircraft there, and they didn't. They didn't know that raid was coming in. Thank God, you know. So, but that we had one mission on the 18th of November, and that film, the SR-71 had a mechanical problem and had to land in Thailand, and there was nobody with a security clearance, and so we never got to see. And I always kind of wonder if they would have seen it, but I think the decision had already been made well above that. They were going.
Oh yeah.
You know. And the other thing that I love is I called it a successful failure because the POWs that were released said there were two major things for them. One was Nixon redoing the bombing of North Vietnam because they knew that was going on and gave them hope. And the other one was they heard about the Son Tay prison raid, and it was their first indication that America cared. We cared that American Special Forces was willing to lose their life to go in and try to get them out. And and the other thing with the Son Tay being that far away, there were a bunch of different small camps that we were monitoring in North Vietnam, and then after that they consolidated them and then there was more camaraderie, there was bigger groups, morale got better, that was the whole thing was better. So that's why I call it a successful failure.
It pushed the politics of the time where it needed to be on the Vietnamese side with the consolidation of those camps. I agree. I had read several accounts of prisoners of war. They were talking about pre-captivity where they were out here all by themselves, and then when they all got put into, I think it was at Hanoi Hilton, wasn't it? Where they
yes,
most of them.
But I think there were, and I remember being 3 different camps, but before that there were 12.
Yeah.
So I think that really helped them.
And that was just in Vietnam. That didn't count the Laotian or the Cambodian camps where there were prisoner of war camps there
Yes.
where they were captured, and they were much more brutal. Dieter Dangler, he was in Laos, was he not? I think he was.
I'm not familiar with that.
He was an A1 pilot that went down, and
Yeah.
he was a naval A1 pilot. And
As a photo interpreter at Task Force Alpha, we stopped everything we were doing. We were looking for our missions were looking for the enemy to interject and cut off their supply lines. That was our job. But we stopped everything when a pilot went down. To help them in any way. We got film and we'd map out an area and say, where do you think the pilot can go, and try to help them in that way.
were you there during the Bat-21 search and rescue?
Well, I was there from November 27th, 1969 to October 1970.
I think he was 71 or 72.
Yeah.
That's where they came up with the imaginary 18 holes of golf.
Yeah, yes.
They walked him out, and I was wondering, because they had to work through your folks as well, because somebody came up with this idea. They knew that Hamilton was a golfer, and then they started laying things out.
Well, and I remember we had codes like a POW or somebody down on the ground could stamp out a code. Those codes were brand new for almost all the missions. So because the first thing that the North Vietnamese wanted to do was down a pilot or an aircraft, and then they would circle it with anti-aircraft, hoping to kill more people coming in. So they didn't necessarily always want to go right after the pilot. They would let them the thing and use them as guinea pigs or bait to bring in more people and stuff. And so we would do everything we could. We would stop everything we were doing to try to do any of the SARs.
How quickly could you get that filmed if one of those aircraft flew over a location in a SAR? How fast could they get it developed and get it to you guys to process and come up with actionable intelligence?
What they would do is say, this is a pinpoint spot where the pilot went down. So we would take the previous missions we had to look at the terrain, be able to help the helicopters and the SAR pilots and say, if you can, try to get word to him to move to the southeast. There's a clearing, that kind of thing.
I gotcha.
And that's what we used it for.
See, now I'd heard the SOG guys talk about where they would get direction to move, so that had to be being coming out of you as well.
I don't know. I've heard that, and I can't confirm or deny that. I don't know. I was never asked to get to do that.
When they would declare a prairie fire emergency and they were about to get overrun, they all of a sudden had all kinds of intel telling them where to go, and they had a good idea of their grid where they were, but
I had a feeling when I was over there that the amount of information that was being transferred was very poor, and that's just my feeling. And I
think you're right on that, because the amount of technology that we had going on, like you said at the time, it was Star Wars.
Oh.
I mean,
it was so far above anybody. I laugh because it was probably a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. I'm watching this program, and it was a thing, the new electronic surveillance on the Mexican border to watch immigrants coming over from Mexico. And there was this brand new technology of cameras and sensors and heat sensors and everything else. And I just laughed. They said, boy, this is doing it. I said, guys, we were doing it 50 years ago in Laos. So that new technology was, so, yeah.
Too funny. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss about your time in the military?
I love being in the military, and I'm extremely proud of my service. And it was frustrating. I wasn't good at the regiment of being in the military, but I loved serving and I loved what I did.
Well, I thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me and shed some light on Task Force Alpha. That's never been done. This is
cool.
the first time anybody's ever talked about that, so I'm so excited.
Cool.